Sometimes the greatest acts of love come disguised as betrayal. In the shadow of Alaska's Denali peaks, where winter lasts 8 months and silence can drive a man mad, Marcus Thorne has kept the same ritual for 3,287 days. Every morning at dawn, he trudges through knee-deep snow to leave fresh meat at the forest's edge, feeding a wolf pup that should have grown into adulthood years ago. Luna approaches with those unsettling, pale blue eyes, the same shade his daughter Sarah inherited from her mother, and Marcus feels that familiar twist in his chest, the one that's kept him isolated in this wilderness since Sarah vanished during the research expedition he was too afraid to lead. But this morning is different. 4 black shapes move between the trees like shadows given form, massive wolves that dwarf any he's studied in his 30 years as a biologist. They don't approach the meat. They're watching him. And Luna, sweet, impossible Luna, tilts her head and releases a haunting howl that seems to split the frozen air itself. Marcus grips his rifle with trembling hands, finally understanding that he's been feeding something far more than a lost pup. He's been keeping a promise he never knew he made. What happens when the wild comes to collect a debt 9 years in the making? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched between heartbeats, broken only by the soft whisper of snow falling from pine boughs. Marcus's breath formed crystalline clouds in the -20 air as he stood frozen at the forest's edge, his weathered hands gripping the rifle stock with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. The 4 black wolves remained motionless, as granite sentinels, their amber eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Luna stepped forward, her small paws barely leaving impressions in the snow that would swallow Marcus to his knees. 9 years old, yet she moved with the fluid grace of something eternal, untouched by time's relentless march. Her pale coat caught the first rays of dawn filtering through the canopy, and those impossible blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, seemed to pierce straight through to the guilt he'd carried like shrapnel in his chest. "Easy, girl," Marcus whispered, though his voice cracked like ice under pressure. The words felt hollow in the vast wilderness, swallowed by the mountain's indifference. "What have you done?" The largest of the black wolves, a massive creature that stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, tilted its head in a gesture so eerily human that Marcus's finger trembled against the rifle's trigger guard. Its coat was darker than the spaces between stars, but there, just visible on its chest, was a small patch of white fur shaped like a crescent moon. Marcus's knees nearly buckled. Sarah had a birthmark, same shape, same placement. "No," he breathed, the word forming a ghost in the frigid air. "That's impossible." But as he stared at the pack, details emerged that his scientific mind couldn't dismiss. The way they arranged themselves in formation, the same triangular patterns Sarah had sketched in her research notes about pack hierarchy. The deliberate patience in their stance, as if they understood something he didn't. And Luna, sweet Luna, watching him with those devastating blue eyes that held too much knowledge for any creature, wild or otherwise. The morning ritual suddenly felt like a mockery. For 9 years he'd trudged through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, leaving offerings of salmon and elk meat, telling himself he was saving an orphaned pup. But the wolves hadn't touched the meat this morning. It lay untouched in the snow, steam rising from the fresh cuts like incense to forgotten gods. Marcus thought of his cabin, 60 yards behind him, a fortress of rough-hewn logs and stubborn determination that had sheltered him through 9 brutal winters. Inside, Sarah's research journals gathered dust on the kitchen table where he'd left them the day she disappeared. Genetic studies of Canis lupus, behavioral analysis of pack structures, theories about wolf intelligence that his colleagues had called brilliant, if unorthodox. She'd wanted to study something unprecedented in these mountains, something about wolves that defied conventional understanding. Marcus had been scheduled to guide her expedition into the deep wilderness, but fear had paralyzed him, fear of failure, of leading his brilliant daughter into danger he couldn't control. So he'd made excuses, invented emergencies, let her go alone into the mountains that had claimed so many before her. The storm that followed lasted 3 days. When it cleared, Search teams found her abandoned campsite and nothing more. No tracks, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just her tent, her equipment, and Marcus's crushing realization that his cowardice had stolen the most precious thing in his world. He'd fled to this remote corner of Denali the following month, choosing isolation over the accusing stares and whispered conversations of colleagues who knew he should have been there. The wilderness became his penance, its brutal honesty a mirror for the self-loathing that gnawed at his soul. Then he'd found Luna, or had she found him? The largest black wolf took a single step forward, its massive paw creating a perfect print in the virgin snow. The other three moved with predatory synchronization, closing the distance by mere inches but somehow making the world feel smaller, more dangerous. Marcus raised the rifle to his shoulder, muscle memory from decades of field research guiding his movements, but his hands shook so violently that the sight danced across the wolves like a leaf in a hurricane. "I don't understand," he said to Luna, his voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" Luna's response was another haunting howl, this one longer and more complex than before. The sound seemed to carry impossible harmonics, notes that resonated in Marcus's bones and made his teeth ache. The four black wolves answered in perfect unison, their voices creating a symphony that spoke of loss and longing and something that might have been forgiveness. In that moment, standing at the threshold between his isolated world and whatever truth these creatures carried in their amber eyes, Marcus Thorne understood that his 9 years of self-imposed exile were ending. The wilderness had accepted his offerings, harbored his guilt, and protected his secrets. Now it was time to pay the price. The wolves vanished like smoke between the trees, their massive forms dissolving into the forest shadows as if they'd been nothing more than figments of Marcus's frost-addled imagination. Only Luna remained, sitting in the snow with that unnerving stillness that had marked all their mornings together. But something fundamental had shifted. The air itself felt different, charged with electricity that made the hair on Marcus's arms stand beneath his thick wool sleeves. He lowered the rifle with trembling hands, the barrel pointing harmlessly at the ground. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal, each beat echoing in the sudden silence. 9 years of carefully constructed routine had just shattered like ice on a spring river, leaving him adrift in uncertainty. "Come on, girl," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold and something deeper. "Let's go home." But Luna didn't move. She watched him with those impossible blue eyes, her small form perfectly still against the pristine snow. For a moment, Marcus wondered if she would follow him at all. The thought sent a spike of panic through his chest, the idea of losing her too, of returning to complete isolation after tasting the bitter comfort of her presence. Then she rose gracefully and padded toward the cabin, her paws making soft sounds in the snow. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cabin squatted against the tree line like a weathered monument to stubbornness, its chimney releasing a thin curl of smoke into the crystalline air. Marcus had built it himself that first winter, working through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his demons. Every log bore the scars of his amateur craftsmanship, every joint sealed with determination rather than skill. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. It was home. Inside, the familiar routine beckoned like an old friend. Marcus set the rifle in its rack beside the door and fed split pine to the wood stove, watching flames dance behind the iron grate. The cabin's single room held everything he needed: a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a kitchen table scarred by years of use, shelves lined with books and supplies. Sarah's research journals occupied the place of honor. At the table S center, their leather covers worn smooth by his nightly readings. Luna had never entered the cabin. In 9 years, she'd maintained an invisible boundary at the threshold, watching him through the windows but never crossing inside. He'd tried to coax her in during particularly brutal storms, leaving the door open and spreading blankets by the fire. She would approach sometimes, close enough that her breath fogged the glass, but something always held her back. Now she sat in her usual spot on the covered porch, visible through the kitchen window. Marcus put coffee on the wood stove and began preparing his own breakfast. Canned beans, yesterday's bread, strips of dried venison. Simple food for a simple existence. He'd learned to find comfort in these small rituals, the way they marked time's passage without demanding anything of him. But this morning felt different. The coffee tasted bitter, the food like sawdust in his mouth. He found himself glancing repeatedly toward the window, expecting to see amber eyes watching from the tree line. The untouched meat still lay in the snow beyond the porch, a testament to whatever had changed between dawn and sunrise. After breakfast, Marcus settled at the table with Sarah's journals, as he had every morning for 9 years. Her handwriting filled the pages in precise scientific script, observations about pack behavior, theories about wolf cognition, sketches of territorial patterns. He knew every word by heart, had memorized her hypotheses about intelligence transfer between generations, her radical ideas about genetic memory in Canis lupus. The wolves here are different, she'd written in her final entries. Their behavior patterns suggest something beyond conventional pack dynamics. They demonstrate problem-solving abilities that approach what we might call reasoning. I need to get closer, to observe them in their natural environment without the interference of civilization. Marcus traced the words with one weathered finger, remembering the excitement in Sarah's voice when she'd shared her theories. She'd believed she was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize wolf research. Her colleagues had been skeptical. Brilliant young scientist or not, some of her ideas pushed the boundaries of accepted science into territory that made veteran researchers uncomfortable. But Marcus had seen the intelligence in her eyes when she spoke about her work. The same intelligence he now saw in Luna's impossible blue gaze. Outside, wind began to rise through the pines, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Marcus rose from the table and checked his supplies. Firewood stacked against the cabin's north wall, canned goods lined up in the pantry, kerosene for the emergency lamp. Self-sufficiency had become second nature, each day a careful balance of preparation and survival. Yet as he performed these familiar tasks, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was preparing for something far more significant than weather. The black wolves had come for a reason, and Luna's response suggested this was only the beginning. The wilderness had been his sanctuary for 9 years, protecting him from the world's judgment and his own crushing guilt. But sanctuaries, Marcus realized, could also become prisons, and the keys to his cell might be waiting in the forest's shadow. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay on his narrow bed, listening to the wind howl through the pines. But beneath the familiar symphony of wilderness sounds, something else stirred. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, circling the cabin in patterns that spoke of intelligence rather than mere animal curiosity. At 2 a.m., he rose and peered through the frost-rimmed window. 4 pairs of amber eyes reflected the cabin's dim light, positioned at exact compass points around his sanctuary. The black wolves had returned, and they were waiting. Luna sat motionless on the porch, her pale form a ghost against the darker wood. She faced outward toward her pack, but occasionally turned those devastating blue eyes toward the window where Marcus watched. In those moments, he felt the weight of unspoken communication passing between them, a message he couldn't decode but desperately needed to understand. By dawn, exhaustion and caffeine had left Marcus's hands shaking as he prepared the morning offering. But as he approached the feeding spot, he discovered something that stopped him cold. The meat from yesterday remained untouched, but arranged around it in a perfect circle were 9 small objects that definitely hadn't been there before. Marcus knelt in the snow, his knees protesting against the cold, and examined them with the methodical precision his scientific training demanded. Stones, each one roughly the size of a silver dollar, worn smooth by countless seasons of weather. But these weren't random river rocks. Someone, or something, had selected them deliberately. 8 were dark granite, nearly black, while the 9th gleamed white as fresh snow. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. 9 stones. 9 years since Sarah's disappearance. 9 years he'd been feeding Luna. With trembling fingers, he lifted the white stone. Carved into its surface, so faint he almost missed it, was a crescent moon shape. The same mark he'd seen on the largest black wolf's chest, the same shape as Sarah's birthmark. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, the words forming crystals in the frigid air. Luna approached then, moving with that eerie grace that defied her supposed age. She stopped just beyond arm's reach and fixed him with her impossible gaze. For the first time in 9 years, Marcus heard her speak. Not words. Wolves didn't speak words. But the soft whine that escaped her throat carried inflections and cadences so familiar that his heart nearly stopped. It was the same sound Sarah used to make when she was thinking through a complex problem, an unconscious vocalization that had marked her concentration since childhood. Marcus dropped the stone and scrambled backward, his scientific mind reeling. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Luna's response was to step forward and gently pick up the white stone in her teeth. She carried it to Marcus and dropped it at his feet, then retreated to watch his reaction. The message was unmistakable. This was meant for him. The black wolves emerged from the tree line then, moving with synchronized precision that spoke of shared purpose. They arranged themselves in a semicircle behind Luna, their massive forms creating a living wall between Marcus and the forest. The largest, the one with the crescent marking, stepped forward and fixed Marcus with a stare that seemed to peer directly into his soul. In that amber gaze, Marcus saw something that shattered his understanding of the natural world: recognition. Not the simple acknowledgement of a familiar scent or sound, but the complex recognition of one intelligent being confronting another. These creatures knew him, more than knew him. They had been waiting for him. Sarah's journal entries flooded back to him with new meaning. Her theories about genetic memory, about intelligence that transcended individual consciousness. Her conviction that the wolves in this region were different, that they demonstrated capabilities science couldn't yet explain. "You want me to come with you," Marcus said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. It wasn't a question. Luna's behavior, the stone circle, the patient vigil, everything pointed toward a deliberate invitation into the deep wilderness where Sarah had vanished. Luna tilted her head in that eerily human gesture of acknowledgement. Marcus looked down at the white stone, then back at the waiting pack. His cabin squatted behind him like an anchor to his old life, filled with 9 years of careful isolation and self-imposed penance. Sarah's research journals waited on the kitchen table. His supplies lined the shelves, everything he'd built to protect himself from the world's judgment and his own crushing guilt. But Luna was walking toward the forest now, pausing at the tree line to look back with those devastating blue eyes. The black wolves fell into formation around her, creating an escort that spoke of reverence rather than dominance. They were leaving, all of them. And Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that this was his only chance to learn the truth about what had happened 9 years ago in the deep wilderness. The choice stretched before him like a chasm, safety in his self-made prison, or answers that might destroy everything he thought he knew about the world. Marcus picked up the white stone and followed Luna into the forest's shadow. Marcus made it exactly 12 steps into the forest before terror froze him solid. The white stone burned in his palm like a coal pulled from the fire, its carved surface biting into his flesh as his grip tightened involuntarily. Around him, ancient pines loomed like cathedral pillars, their branches creating a canopy so thick that morning light filtered through in scattered fragments. The air tasted different here, older, heavier with secrets the wilderness had been keeping for millennia. Luna continued ahead, her pale form ghosting between the trees with supernatural grace. The 4 black wolves flanked her in perfect formation, their massive paws making no sound on the snow-covered ground. They moved like smoke given form, and Marcus realized with growing dread that he was no longer in control of this situation. Perhaps he never had been. "Wait," he called out, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Just wait a goddamn minute." Luna stopped and turned, those impossible blue eyes regarding him with what might have been patience or pity. The black wolves settled into hunting crouches, their amber gazes fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity. In that moment, he understood exactly how a rabbit felt when the hawk's shadow passed overhead. Marcus's scientific training warred with primal terror as his mind catalogued everything wrong with this scenario. Wolves didn't organize expeditions. They didn't leave symbolic offerings. They certainly didn't communicate with aging hermits through carved stones and meaningful glances. Yet here he stood, 67 years old and following a pack into the deep wilderness based on nothing more than a desperate hope that madness might somehow lead to answers. What if he was wrong? What if 9 years of isolation had finally cracked his sanity, and these were just ordinary wolves who would tear him apart the moment they moved beyond sight of his cabin? What if Luna was simply a wild animal he'd anthropomorphized beyond recognition, and his guilt over Sarah had manufactured connections that existed only in his fractured mind? The white stone seemed to pulse against his palm, and Marcus looked down at it with fresh horror. The crescent moon carving stared back at him like an accusation. Sarah's birthmark, the wolves' markings, Luna's eyes, every rational explanation his scientific mind produced crumbled under the weight of impossible coincidences that felt too deliberate to be chance. But what if they weren't coincidences? What if Sarah's theories about genetic memory and transcendent intelligence had been more than academic speculation? What if something in these mountains operated according to rules that science hadn't yet discovered, and his daughter had stumbled into forces beyond human understanding? The thought made Marcus's stomach lurch. If Sarah had encountered whatever he was facing now, what had happened to her? Had she made this same journey into the deep wilderness? Had she stood where he now stood, weighing impossible choices against unbearable uncertainty? And if she had, where was she now? Marcus glanced back toward his cabin, barely visible through the trees. 9 years of carefully constructed isolation beckoned like a siren song. Inside those log walls waited safety, routine, and the comfortable numbness that had carried him through countless bitter winters. His supplies, his books. Sarah's journals filled with theories that suddenly felt less like science and more like prophecy. He could still turn back. The wolves hadn't threatened him directly, yet. Luna had always returned from their dawn encounters, always maintained her vigil on the porch. Perhaps this was simply another ritual in their strange relationship, and tomorrow would bring the familiar comfort of morning offerings and distant observation. But even as Marcus told himself these comforting lies, he knew they were exactly that. Something fundamental had shifted in the wilderness's careful balance. The untouched meat still lay in the snow behind him, growing cold in the mountain air. The stone circle marked an ending as surely as Sarah's abandoned campsite had 9 years ago. Luna took 3 steps deeper into the forest, then stopped again. Her message was unmistakable. This was his last chance to choose. Behind him lay the safety of ignorance and self-imposed exile. Ahead waited answers that might destroy everything he thought he understood about the world, about loss, about the boundaries between what was possible and what was real. Marcus thought of Sarah's voice, excited and breathless, as she shared her theories about wolf intelligence. He remembered the light in her eyes when she spoke about her research, the conviction that drove her into these mountains alone while her coward father made excuses and invented emergencies to avoid accompanying her. Fear had paralyzed him then, and fear threatened to paralyze him now. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of confronting truths that might be too terrible to bear. But Luna was moving again, and the black wolves were following, and Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that he was about to lose his second chance at courage. The white stone pulsed once more against his palm, warm as living flesh. Marcus closed his eyes, whispered a prayer to gods he'd stopped believing in years ago, and followed the wolves deeper into the forest's heart. The first steps felt like walking into his own grave. Marcus stumbled through underbrush that seemed to reach for him with skeletal fingers, his breath forming ragged clouds in the crystalline air. Behind him, the last glimpse of his cabin's chimney smoke disappeared between the pines, severing his final connection to 9 years of carefully constructed safety. There would be no turning back now, not because the wolves wouldn't let him, but because he finally understood that turning back would mean dying a coward's death, just as he had 9 years ago when Sarah needed him most. The white stone had grown warm in his palm, its carved surface seeming to pulse with its own heartbeat. Marcus gripped it like a talisman against the growing darkness that pressed in from all sides, though whether the darkness was real or born of his own terror, he could no longer tell. The forest here felt different than the familiar woods around his cabin, older, deeper, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his scientific mind recoil from explanations it wasn't prepared to accept. Luna moved ahead of him with that impossible grace, her pale form weaving between ancient trees like a ghost returning to familiar haunts. The black wolves flanked their procession in perfect formation, their massive bodies flowing over fallen logs and through thickets without disturbing so much as a branch. Marcus crashed along behind them like a drunken bear, his boots breaking through snow crust with sounds that seemed to echo through the entire wilderness. They had been walking for perhaps 30 minutes when Marcus realized something that made his blood turn to ice water. He couldn't hear anything but their movement. No bird calls, no wind through the pines, no distant crack of settling timber or rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. The forest had fallen into the kind of absolute silence that spoke of predators so apex that every other living thing held its breath until they passed. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The most unsettling part was the growing certainty that the silence wasn't caused by the wolves at all. It was caused by whatever they were walking toward. Marcus tried to catalogue their route, to maintain the kind of mental map that might help him find his way back if everything went to hell. But the forest seemed to shift around them like a living thing, familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing in his peripheral vision. He caught glimpses of formations he was certain he'd seen before, a lightning-split pine, a boulder balanced on smaller stones like some ancient dolmen, yet they appeared in impossible combinations that defied his memory of the terrain. Sarah's journal entries whispered in his mind, "The wolves here demonstrate problem-solving abilities that approach what we might call reasoning." Had she walked this same path? Had she felt this same creeping sensation that the natural world was bending itself around her passage, guiding her toward something that human consciousness wasn't equipped to comprehend? The thought made Marcus stumble, his hand shooting out to catch himself against a tree trunk. The bark felt wrong under his palm, too smooth, too warm, almost organic in a way that had nothing to do with being alive. He jerked his hand back and discovered that his fingers had left impressions in the surface, as if the ancient wood had softened at his touch. Luna stopped and looked back at him, her blue eyes reflecting a light that didn't come from the filtered sunshine overhead. In that gaze, Marcus saw something that nearly brought him to his knees, compassion, not the simple recognition he might expect from a wild animal, but the complex empathy of one thinking being acknowledging another's fear and choosing to show mercy. "What are you?" he whispered, though he was no longer certain he wanted an answer. Luna tilted her head in that eerily human gesture, then turned and continued deeper into the forest. The black wolves adjusted their formation, moving closer to Marcus in what felt like protection rather than threat. The largest, the one bearing the crescent mark, briefly touched its massive shoulder against Marcus's leg, and he felt a shock of warmth that had nothing to do with body heat. They were helping him. Whatever these creatures were, whatever impossible intelligence drove their actions, they understood that he was struggling and had chosen to ease his passage. The realization should have comforted him, but instead it filled Marcus with existential dread that threatened to buckle his knees. If the wolves were helping him reach his destination, what waited at journey's end that required their assistance? What truth had Sarah discovered in these same woods that demanded a pack of impossible creatures to guide her father to the same revelation? The white stone pulsed against his palm like a second heart, and Marcus pressed forward into the gathering darkness, following Luna toward answers that might destroy everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between life and death, between human and animal, between what was possible and what was real. Behind him, the last echoes of his old life faded into silence. The first test came without warning. Marcus had been following Luna's ghostly form for perhaps an hour, when the forest floor simply vanished beneath his feet. One moment he was crunching through snow-covered undergrowth, The next, he was plunging into a hidden ravine that opened like the earth's hungry mouth. His fingers clawed desperately at exposed roots and crumbling stone as gravity dragged him toward jagged rocks 20 feet below. The white stone tumbled from his grip, its carved surface catching the filtered light as it fell. Marcus watched his only connection to sanity disappear into the darkness and felt his heart stop beating entirely. Without that tangible link to whatever impossible reality he'd stumbled into, he was just a terrified old man about to die alone in the wilderness, his bones joining the countless others that these mountains had claimed over the millennia. Then massive jaws clamped around his wrist. The largest black wolf, the one with the crescent marking, had appeared at the ravine's edge as if materialized from shadow itself. Its teeth punctured Marcus's jacket, but somehow found the precise pressure needed to grip without breaking skin. The creature's amber eyes met his with startling intelligence as it began to haul him upward with strength that defied natural law. Marcus scrabbled for purchase against the ravine wall, his boots finding tiny ledges in the stone while the wolf's steady pull drew him back toward safety. Below him, the white stone had wedged itself between two rocks, gleaming like a star fallen to earth. Just as his fingertips brushed the ravine's edge, the wolf released him and padded backward, watching with what Marcus could only interpret as expectation. The message was unmistakable: retrieve the stone yourself, or lose it forever. Marcus hauled himself over the lip and lay gasping in the snow, his scientific mind reeling from what had just occurred. The wolf could have simply pulled him to safety, should have, by every law of animal behavior he understood. Instead, it had created a test, a challenge that required him to demonstrate commitment to this impossible journey. He looked down at the white stone, now 20 feet below him in a crevice barely wide enough for human shoulders. The descent would be treacherous. The ascent might be impossible. But Luna waited at the forest's edge, her pale form motionless as carved ice, and Marcus understood that she wouldn't take another step until he proved himself worthy of the answers they guarded. The climb down nearly killed him. Marcus's 67-year-old joints protested every movement as he wedged himself between the ravine walls, his fingers seeking holds in stone that seemed to shift like living flesh. Twice his boots slipped on moss-covered ledges, sending loose rock cascading into the depths below. His breath came in ragged gasps that echoed off the walls like whispers from some underground hell. But when his fingers finally closed around the white stone, warmth flooded through him like electricity. The carved crescent moon seemed to pulse against his palm with renewed vigor, and Marcus felt something impossible: approval. Not from the stone itself, that way lay madness, but from whatever intelligence had orchestrated this entire encounter. The ascent proved even more harrowing. His shoulders burned as he hauled himself upward foot by agonizing foot, the pack's amber eyes watching from above with predatory patience. Several times Marcus felt his grip weakening and prepared himself for the fall that would end everything. But each time the largest wolf appeared at the ravine's edge, its massive form blocking out the pale sky, and Marcus found the strength to continue. When he finally collapsed onto solid ground, the white stone clutched against his chest like a beating heart. Luna approached for the first time since their journey began. She padded close enough that he could see the impossible depth in her blue eyes, close enough to confirm what his rational mind refused to accept. This creature's gaze held human intelligence, not animal cunning or learned behavior, but the complex awareness that marked true consciousness. Luna lowered her head and gently touched her nose to the white stone. The contact sent a shock through Marcus's entire body, not painful, but transformative, as if every cell in his being had suddenly remembered a frequency it had forgotten. For one impossible moment, he felt connected not just to Luna, but to the entire pack, their shared purpose flowing through him like warm honey. Then Luna stepped back and resumed her position at the forest's edge, waiting. The test was complete, but Marcus understood with growing dread that it had been only the beginning. Whatever lay deeper in these woods would demand more than physical courage. It would require him to abandon every assumption about reality he'd clung to for 67 years. The black wolves fell into formation around him once more, but their positioning had changed subtly. Where before they had seemed to guard against his escape, now they moved like protectors defending something precious. Marcus tucked the white stone into his jacket pocket and followed Luna deeper into the wilderness, knowing that each step carried him further from the world of scientific rationality and closer to truths that might destroy his sanity entirely. Behind them, the ravine filled with shadows that moved like living things, sealing off any possibility of retreat. The forest deepened around them like a living cathedral, ancient pines reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly distant. Marcus felt the white stone's warmth against his ribs with each labored breath, a constant reminder that he had crossed some fundamental threshold. The ravine test had changed something in the pack's dynamic. Where Luna had maintained careful distance before, now she occasionally glanced back with what Marcus could only interpret as concern for his well-being. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but the wolves showed no signs of slowing. If anything, their pace had quickened since his successful retrieval of the stone, as if some cosmic timer had begun counting down toward an inevitable confrontation. The thought made Marcus's stomach clench with renewed terror. What waited at their destination that required such urgency? What had Sarah found in these same woods that demanded a pack of impossible creatures to guide her father along an identical path? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each spawning a dozen more until Marcus felt his sanity fracturing under their weight. He forced himself to focus on immediate concerns: the placement of his feet, the rhythm of his breathing, the hypnotic sway of Luna's pale form ahead. But even these simple anchors felt unstable in a forest that seemed to operate by rules his scientific mind couldn't process. They crested a ridge that Marcus didn't remember from any topographical map, and the landscape beyond made him stumble to a halt. A vast valley stretched below them, shrouded in mist that moved with deliberate purpose rather than natural wind patterns. At its center stood a structure that shouldn't exist, a circle of standing stones that predated any known civilization in Alaska, their surfaces covered in symbols that hurt Marcus's eyes to look at directly. Luna descended toward the valley without hesitation, but Marcus remained frozen on the ridge. The stone circle called to him with magnetic intensity, yet every instinct screamed warnings about what lay within those ancient markers. He thought of Sarah's final journal entry. The intelligence here transcends species boundaries. Something is calling to me from the deep places, and I must answer. Had she stood on this same ridge 9 years ago? Had she felt this same terrible pull toward truths that existed beyond human comprehension? The white stone pulsed against his chest like a second heart, its rhythm matching the barely audible thrumming that seemed to emanate from the valley floor. The largest black wolf appeared at Marcus's shoulder, close enough that he could feel its breath against his neck. When he turned to meet its amber gaze, he saw something that made his knees nearly buckle: recognition. Not the simple acknowledgement of a familiar scent, but the complex understanding that passed between old friends reuniting after long separation. Impossible, Marcus whispered, but the word felt hollow in the charged air. The wolf's massive head tilted in that eerily human gesture, and Marcus found himself studying the creature's features with growing horror. The bone structure around the eyes, the set of the ears, the way it held its head when listening. Details that should have meant nothing but instead triggered memories he'd buried so deep that their resurrection felt like psychological archaeology. Sarah had owned a German shepherd named Kodiak during her graduate studies. The dog had accompanied her on countless research trips until its death from cancer 3 years before her disappearance. Marcus remembered the way Kodiak had tilted his head when processing complex commands, the intelligence that had shone in his dark eyes when Sarah spoke to him like an equal rather than a pet. This wolf held itself the same way, looked at him with that same impossible understanding. The realization should have sent Marcus fleeing back toward his cabin, but instead it anchored him to the ridge with terrible certainty. If the boundaries between species could blur in this place, if death itself might not be the absolute ending he'd always believed, then Sarah's fate remained unwritten. The hope he'd buried 9 years ago clawed its way back to the surface like something rising from a grave. Luna had reached the valley floor and was approaching the stone circle's perimeter. She moved with reverent caution now, each step deliberate as a ritual dance. The mist parted before her passage and reformed behind it, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing in an alphabet older than human language. The other wolves descended single file, their massive forms ghosting through the vapor with predatory grace. Only the marked one remained beside Marcus, waiting with infinite patience for him to make the final choice that would determine whether he joined Sarah in whatever impossible reality this place represented, or fled back to the safe ignorance of his mountaintop exile. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the white stone's pulse synchronize with his heartbeat. When he opened them again, Luna had reached the stone circle's center and was looking back at him across the misty valley. Even at this distance, her blue eyes blazed with unmistakable urgency. Time was running out. Whatever window had opened in the fabric of reality was beginning to close, and if Marcus hesitated much longer, he would lose his only chance to learn what had become of his daughter. He took the first step down into the valley, following Luna toward revelations that would either reunite him with Sarah or destroy his mind entirely. The descent into the valley felt like walking through liquid darkness. With each step, the mist thickened around Marcus until he could barely see Luna's pale form ahead, yet somehow his feet found solid ground with impossible certainty. The white stone burned against his chest like a coal pulled from some ancient fire, its pulsing rhythm now synchronized with a low thrumming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The temperature plummeted as he approached the stone circle. His breath emerged in crystalline clouds that lingered too long in the still air, and frost began forming on his eyebrows despite the complete absence of wind. The silence was absolute. Not even the whisper of his own footsteps on the valley floor reached his ears. It was as if sound itself had been swallowed by whatever force emanated from those towering monoliths. Luna waited at the circle's edge, her blue eyes reflecting light that came from no earthly source. As Marcus drew closer, he could see the symbols carved into the nearest stone more clearly, and the sight made his vision swim. The markings weren't just ancient, they were impossible. Geometric patterns that folded in on themselves like optical illusions, creating depth where none should exist. His scientific mind tried to categorize them, to find some reference point in his decades of study, but they defied every classification system he'd ever learned. The black wolves had arranged themselves around the circle's perimeter at precise intervals, their amber eyes fixed on Marcus with unblinking intensity. He felt their collective attention like physical weight, and understood that he stood at the threshold of something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality. There would be no returning to his simple existence on the mountain after this moment. Whatever truth waited within the stone circle would burn away the comfortable ignorance that had sustained through 9 years of grief. As he stepped between two of the massive stones, the world exploded into sensation that had nothing to do with his physical senses. The white stone's warmth became a searing presence that seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of his body, connecting him to networks of consciousness that spanned impossible distances. He felt Luna's wild intelligence merge with something achingly familiar, something that made his heart stop beating entirely. "Dad?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on frequencies that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his soul. Marcus fell to his knees in the circle's center, the white stone tumbling from nerveless fingers to land on symbols that blazed to life at its touch. The carved crescent moon aligned perfectly with matching marks in the ancient stone, and reality fractured like glass struck by lightning. Sarah stood before him. Not Luna. Not some impossible hybrid between human and wolf. Sarah herself, exactly as she'd appeared 9 years ago on the morning she'd kissed his cheek and promised to radio in every 12 hours. Her dark hair caught spectral light that streamed from between the monoliths, and her eyes, those same brilliant blue eyes that had haunted his dreams, regarded him with infinite compassion. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice carrying echoes of wind through pine needles, of wolf songs under starlit skies. "I knew you'd come eventually. Knew you'd follow Luna home." Marcus tried to speak, but could only produce a broken sob. His hands reached toward her with desperate hunger, needing to confirm that she was real, that 9 years of guilt and grief could be swept away by simple touch. but Sarah stepped back, shaking her head with gentle firmness. "Not yet," she whispered. "You don't understand what this place is, what I've become. The change isn't complete, and if you try to hold on to the me you remember, we'll both be lost." The pack circled them now, moving through the stone circle as if the ancient barriers meant nothing. Marcus watched in growing horror as their forms began to shift, becoming translucent, revealing the human consciousness trapped within lupine bodies. He recognized faces from missing persons reports, researchers who'd vanished in these mountains over decades, all of them caught between states of being, suspended in a transformation that defied natural law. "This is the choice, Dad," Sarah continued, her form beginning to flicker like a flame in wind. "You can return to your cabin, carry your grief back to the mountain, and live out your remaining years in ignorance. Or you can stay here with us, become part of something larger than human understanding." The white stone pulsed between them like a bridge spanning two worlds. Marcus felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. His cowardice 9 years ago, when he'd let fear prevent him from leading Sarah's expedition himself, the years of isolation that had followed, the slow erosion of hope until only guilt remained. All of it could be erased with a single choice. But as he reached for the stone, Sarah's expression filled with terrible urgency. "The window is closing," she said, her voice now carrying undertones of something that was no longer entirely human. "Choose quickly, Dad. Choose now before the transformation claims me completely and you lose the daughter you're trying to save." Marcus lunged for the white stone, his fingers outstretched toward the only bridge between his world and Sarah's, but as his hand closed around its smooth surface, the stone crumbled to ash that scattered on wind that existed only within the circle's boundaries. The ancient symbols that had blazed with otherworldly light flickered and died, leaving only cold granite marked with shallow scratches that could have been carved by any amateur hiker. "No!" The word tore from his throat like a physical thing, but already Sarah's form was dissolving at the edges, her face becoming indistinct as wolf and human features blurred together in impossible ways. "Sarah, wait!" She tried to speak, but only a mournful howl emerged from lips that were no longer entirely human. The sound shattered something fundamental in Marcus's chest, not just hope, but the very foundation of his sanity. For one perfect moment, he had touched the impossible. He had found his daughter alive, transformed but present. Now that connection was severing like a rope under too much weight. The black wolves circled faster, their forms becoming transparent as Sarah's had, but where she fought to maintain human consciousness, they seemed to welcome the dissolution. Marcus watched in horror as faces he'd recognized from missing persons reports, Dr. Elena Vasquez, who'd vanished in 2018, the graduate student Timothy Chen from 2020, half a dozen others, faded into pure lupine instinct. Their human awareness didn't transform, it simply ended, leaving only predatory intelligence in amber eyes that had once held doctoral degrees and dreams of scientific discovery. "The window," Sarah managed, her voice now more growl than speech, closing too fast. "I tried to hold it open, but—" Her words dissolved into another howl, and Marcus understood with crushing certainty that he had arrived too late. Whatever cosmic alignment had allowed the transformation to be reversible was collapsing, taking Sarah with it. The daughter he'd spent 9 years searching for had been here all along, trapped in Luna's form, fighting to maintain enough humanity to guide him to this moment, and he had failed her again. The stone circle began to sink into the valley floor, as if the earth itself was reclaiming what should never have been exposed. Marcus scrambled toward Sarah's flickering form, but the ground tilted beneath his feet, sending him sliding toward the circle's edge. The ancient stones groaned like living things as they descended, and the symbols that had briefly blazed with revelation became nothing more than weathered scratches on sinking granite. "I should have led the expedition myself," Marcus screamed into the collapsing void. "I should have been with you from the beginning." Sarah's blue eyes found his one last time, and in them he saw not accusation but forgiveness that cut deeper than any blame could have. She had never held his cowardice against him. Even transformed, even trapped between species for 9 years, she had somehow found the strength to absolve the father, who had let fear override love when she needed him most. Then she was gone. Not dead. Marcus would have preferred death's finality to this, but lost in a way that transcended mere mortality. Luna bounded away from the sinking stones with purely animal grace, no trace of human intelligence remaining in her pale blue eyes. She paused at the valley's edge to look back once, and Marcus saw only wolf instinct where his daughter, consciousness, had struggled to survive. The largest black wolf, the one he'd thought might be Kodiak, padded close as the stone circle completed its descent into earth that closed over it like healing flesh. When Marcus met its amber gaze, he found no recognition, no memory of the German shepherd that had once tilted its head in that same questioning manner. Whatever human connection had briefly flickered there was extinguished, leaving only predator and prey dynamics that made Marcus's position terrifyingly clear. The pack reformed around him, but their protective formation had dissolved into something far more ominous. These were no longer guardians guiding him toward reunion with Sarah. They were hunters who had watched their territory's greatest secret sink beyond reach, and Marcus was the witness who could never be allowed to leave. His radio crackled to life in his jacket pocket, Tom's voice cutting through the supernatural silence. "Marcus, you out there? Weather Service is calling for the worst blizzard in a decade. You need to get back to your cabin before—" The transmission cut off as the largest wolf's jaws clamped down on Marcus's sleeve, its massive head shaking with the practiced motion of a predator breaking prey's neck. Only the thick winter coat prevented fangs from reaching flesh, but the message was unmistakable. He belonged to the wilderness now, another researcher who would simply vanish into the statistics of people lost to Alaska's unforgiving mountains. Above them, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, promising a whiteout that would erase all traces of Marcus's final journey into the valley, where impossible things died stillborn, taking hope with them into the frozen dark.